Quorum being present, the subcommittee will come to order. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin by welcoming our witnesses. Thank you for joining us to discuss an issue important to everyone in this room, protecting the health and safety of American workers. We're here today because we all agree that hardworking men and women should be able to earn a paycheck without risking a serious injury or being exposed to a deadly disease. And every family deserves the peace of mind that their loved ones are safe on the job. We also agree that federal policies play a role in meeting that shared goal. This hearing is timely because next week marks 45 years that the Occupational Safety and Health Administration has helped keep America's workers safe. As part of this committee's oversight efforts, we were pleased to have Assistant Secretary Michaels join us last October to discuss what more can be done to promote safe and healthy working conditions. The question before the committee then, and today, is whether the workplace rules and regulations coming out of Washington serve the best interests of employees and their employers. Are they practical? Are they responsible? Are they fair? Are they created with transparency and enforced effectively? These are important questions because the strongest health and safety rules will do little to protect America's workers if the rules are not followed and enforced, or if they're too confusing and complex to even implement in the first place. I hope we have a thoughtful discussion today that addresses these points, particularly as they relate to OSHA's new Silica standard. In March, OSHA issued a final rule that significantly reduces the permissible exposure limit to crystalline silica. Silica is the second most common element found in the Earth's crust and a key component of manufactured products and construction materials. But exposure to high concentrations of silica dust can lead to a dangerous, debilitating, and even life-threatening disease. We have witnessed important progress in recent years, but we know there's more that can be done to keep workers out of harm's way. That's why this committee has pressed OSHA to use the tools at its disposal to enforce existing standards. Unfortunately, the agency has failed to do so. OSHA itself admits that 30% of tested job sites have not complied with the existing exposure limit for silica, the existing exposure limit for silica. Did I mention it was the existing exposure limit for silica? This is an alarmingly high figure. But instead of enforcing the rules already on the books, the department spent significant time and resources crafting an entirely new regulatory regime. The department's first priority should have been enforcing existing standards, and some potentially in the room today may question whether these rules were followed and if indeed, as a result of not being enforced across the board, they experience the results of silicosis. If OSHA is unable or unwilling to enforce the current limit for silica exposure, why should we expect the results under these new standards to be any different? Related to enforcement, some have raised concerns about whether the new standards can be responsibly enforced. It's been suggested that silica cannot be accurately measured at the reduced limit prescribed in the new law, or new rule, because many labs don't have the technology necessary to provide reliable results. Will employers, acting in good faith and trying to do the right thing, be held accountable for an enforcement regime that isn't feasible or practical? These are important questions about enforcement, but there are also serious questions concerning implementation. Can these new rules be effectively implemented on the ground and under the time frame prescribed by OSHA? Employers may lack the time and resources necessary to adjust their workplaces to the requirements of the new rule. Others may find new controls simply unworkable. This is especially true for small businesses. According to the National Federation of Independent Businesses, this rule will cost workplaces more than $7 billion each year. These costs will be borne by consumers and taxpayers, and may I suggest, employees with a loss of job or loss of security in the job. They'll be borne by all of these people in the form of higher prices for homes, bridges, roads, etc. And these costs will be borne by workers in the form of fewer jobs. These are significant consequences for a rule that may do little to enhance worker health and safety, which is our key priority. Hundreds of thousands of workplaces nationwide will be impacted by these new rules. We owe it to our nation's job creators to provide the clarity and certainty they need to expand, hire, and succeed. And just as importantly, we owe it to workers and their families to promote smart, responsible, regulatory policies that are implemented and enforced in a way that serves their best interests. The workers with us today, and those working on countless job sites across the country, deserve more than our good intentions and political rhetoric at times. They deserve good policies that lead to good results. I know that we can work together to protect the health and well-being. It's happened here. It's happened here before. It can happen now. The well-being of hardworking men and women of this country. I look forward to today's discussion and will now yield to Ranking Member Wilson for her opening remarks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing today to review OSHA's long-awaited rule updating the Silica standard. The science is clear. Since 1974, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health has called for OSHA to cut the permissible exposure limit for general industry from 100 micrograms per cubic meter to 50. It took 42 years for OSHA's rule to catch up with the science. In 1997, the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer determined crystalline silica dust is carcinogenic to humans. The Department of Health and Human Services declared the same in 2000. Silica dust causes silicosis, lung cancer, respiratory illnesses such as COPD, and kidney disease. Yet, scientific research demonstrates OSHA's previous 40-year-old silica standard fails to adequately protect workers from these preventable diseases. Let me repeat, preventable. These diseases are preventable. Extensive scientific evidence shows lung cancer and silicosis occur at exposure levels below OSHA's previous permissible exposure limit of 100 micrograms per cubic meter for workers in general. Surprisingly, the alarming out-of-date construction industry standard of 250 micrograms per cubic meter stems from a 1929 Public Health Service recommendation that the government acknowledged was not set at a level to protect workers from silicosis, but rather based solely on feasibility considerations of 1920s technology and measurement methods. OSHA's new silica dust standard reflects current science and technology. It will save lives. Over 800,000 construction workers and another 295,000 workers in general industry and maritime are exposed to crystalline silica in excess of the new, more protective standard of 50 micrograms per cubic meter. OSHA estimates this new standard, which includes engineering controls, training, prohibitions of dry sweeping, and medical surveillance, will save more than 600 lives each year and prevent more than 900 cases of silicosis each year. I just want to show here on the screen pictures of airborne silica. This is dust generated by a power saw cutting through concrete block with and without engineering controls. All it takes is water or air to control silica dust. These pictures make it abundantly clear how using simple controls reduces workers' and bystanders' exposure to silica dust. While useful statistics and pictures fail to communicate the true toll on affected workers and their families. This includes workers like Dale McNabb, Tom Ward, and Tim Brown, who have submitted statements for the record. I ask unanimous consent to include the statements of Mr. McNabb, Mr. Ward, and Mr. Brown into the record.
Hearing no objection, they'll be included.
Dale McNabb, who has joined us here today, is a tile setter from Warren, Michigan. Raise your hand, Dale. And a member of Bricklayers Local Number 2 in Michigan. In his statement, Dale recounts his exposure to silica dust while working as a tile helper, mixing cement and making cuts. After Dale started wheezing, he went to doctors who confirmed his respiratory problems were caused by silica exposure. Dale writes, "I loved my job, and I took a lot of pride in my work. I would still be doing it today if my doctors hadn't told me I couldn't, and that I might never work again because I breathed in silica dust. When I get exposed to dust now, and not just silica dust, it feels like I have a plastic bag over my head and someone's pulling it shut." Also with us today is Tom Ward. Raise your hand, Tom. Tom is a bricklayer from Detroit, Michigan. At 13, Tom lost his father to silicosis. In his statement, Tom shares this painful story. Tom writes, "We got the official diagnosis, silicosis, when my dad was 34 years old. The hardest memory to live with is the last day he worked. He came in the door, fell to the floor, and started crying. He said, 'I can't do it anymore.' It took just 5 years for silicosis to kill him. It was a slow and very painful process for my dad to experience at far too young an age, 34 years old. It was hard for me, my sisters, and my mother to witness. In the end, his disease actually suffocated him." Tom, who is himself a construction worker exposed to silica dust, remains stunned at the lack of training on and awareness of the dangers of silica dust and the inconsistent use of engineering controls and personal protective equipment. We are also joined by Tim Brown. Raise your hand, Tim. Tim is a bricklayer from Milwaukee and a member of Bricklayers Local 8 who has worked in dust-producing trades his entire life. In his statement, Tim recounts the lack of proper engineering controls on work sites and his eventual diagnosis of silicosis. Tim writes, "I have a 6-year-old daughter. She knows I'm sick, and she worries about me. She doesn't want me to return to construction, but I'm not sure how to provide for her if I can't." Dale, Tom, and Tim have testified in support of the new OSHA standards so that others would not go through what they have endured. As we deliberate today, Mr. Chairman, I hope we can keep in mind what these and so many other hard-working Americans faced because OSHA's Silica standards were not protective enough. The 2.3 million workers, mostly in construction, who will gain protection under OSHA's updated rule deserves our support. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today and look forward to their testimony. I want to thank the 50 members of the International Union of Bricklayers and Allied Crafters who have also joined us here today. Raise your hands. Welcome. You are our constituents. This is your committee, Workforce Protection, and that's our job. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentlelady. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, all subcommittee members will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the permanent hearing record. And without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow statements, questions for the record, and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted in the official hearing record. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's witnesses. Mr. Ed Brady, President of Brady Homes of Illinois in Bloomington, Illinois. Mr. Brady serves as NAHB's 2016 Chairman of the Board. Brady Homes is a family-owned, second-generation building and development company founded by his father, William Brady. Mr. Brady will also testify on behalf of the National Association of Home Builders. Welcome. Janice Hershkowitz is President and CEO of PRL Industries, a family-owned second-generation company located in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. She's also president of Regal Cast, an operating company under PRL Industries that manufactures high-quality specification metal castings, fabrications, and fully machined components to the defense, nuclear, and energy industries. Ms. Hershkowitz will also testify on behalf of the American Foundry Society. Welcome. Dr. Jim Milius is the Director of Research for the Laborers' Health and Safety Fund of North America. Dr. Milius is an occupational physician and epidemiologist. He spent several years directing occupational and environmental health programs for the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health and for the New York State Department of Health. Welcome. And finally, Henry Chayette, a shareholder in Washington, D.C., Region Office of Jackson Lewis, P.C., will testify on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Chayette is well-versed in environmental, safety, and health law involving federal entities such as OSHA, MSHA, and EPA. Welcome. I'll now ask our witnesses to stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? You may be seated. Let the record reflect the witness is answered in the affirmative, and we appreciate that. Before I recognize you for your testimony, let me briefly explain our lighting system. Very simple, like the traffic lights on the roadway. You have 5 minutes to testify. Keep it as close to that as humanly possible. If it comes to the end of the time and you have a finishing sentence or paragraph, go ahead and do that. You'll each have 5 minutes to present. When you see the yellow light go on, that means you have a minute left in your testimony time. The red light, you know what that means. After you've testified, the members will have 5 minutes each to ask questions as well, and we will attempt to keep that as well to 5-minute questioning so that we can get through as much as possible this morning in the hearing time. And so now it's time to recognize the witnesses for their 5 minutes of testimony, and so Mr. Brady, I recognize you now for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Wahlberg, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the committee. On behalf of the 140,000 members of the National Association of Home Builders, I appreciate the opportunity to testify here today. OSHA's new Silica rule is the most significant health and safety standard ever issued for the construction industry. Throughout the rulemaking process, NAHB sought to engage with OSHA to create a workable rule which protects our workers. Unfortunately, OSHA failed to address many of the industry concerns, and the final rule reflects a fundamental lack of understanding of construction and is technologically and economically infeasible. We strongly urge OSHA to revisit the rule and work with us to create a new rule that protects workers while also balancing the technological and economic challenges in the residential construction sector. Absent that, Congress must move swiftly to stop this flawed rule. OSHA's new Silica standard requires a staggering 80% reduction in the permissible exposure limit, or PEL, for the construction industry. To achieve this dramatically lower PEL, OSHA has concocted an aggressive compliance regime of engineering and work practice controls that in many cases cannot be applied in residential construction. If this rule goes into effect, we'll have two options to comply. The first option is to measure the amount of silica a worker is exposed to. This is incredibly challenging to do in the field, where multiple workers may be performing multiple tasks and where many environmental factors play a significant role. Employers would need to track individual employees and would be required to pay for the worker to receive a thorough medical checkup, even though the medical checkup and the results will not tell what tasks or even on which job site might, and I emphasize might, be contributing to the potential health problems. The second option is for employers to follow the engineering and work practice control requirements in Table 1. Unfortunately, these requirements are often impractical and at times impossible to implement in the field. For example, Table 1 relies heavily on wet cutting methods. That seems simple, but frankly, we might not even have water service to the job site for weeks or possibly months after the job starts. Wet cutting is also impractical indoors, adding water to an indoor environment, and during the winter months, unrealistic or could potentially create even greater hazards outdoors. It's also important to consider the economic impact of this rule on the construction industry. OSHA estimates that the total cost of the final rule are just over $1 billion annually. This estimate drastically underestimates the impact this rule will have on our industry. An independent analysis of the rule, which NAHB helped fund, estimated the true cost at nearly $5 billion. Residential construction share of this cost means nearly 25% of the profits for the industry would be consumed by this single rule. You might have the notion that home builders has high profit margins, but the reality is the typical margin is around 6.4%. I raise this point because OSHA's guidelines for justifying a new rule is the cost should be no more than 10% of the industry's profits. They missed the mark here. To see how far they're off, let's look quickly at the health screening I mentioned earlier. OSHA estimates the screening will run at least $377 per test each. There are 3.2 million construction workers. So if each construction employee required one screening per year, that cost alone would be roughly $1.2 billion a year. OSHA also severely underestimated other compliance costs. Most of our members at NAHB are small firms, family businesses, and don't have the expertise to comply with some of the requirements of the rule. Many will need to contract for these services of record keeping. OSHA's economic analysis identifies just over 477,000 affected businesses in the construction industry. If you assume a minimal cost of routine bookkeeping services at $200 a month, it would work out to $1.1 billion per year just for the record-keeping compliance. We feel that OSHA simply failed to account for the true cost of these expenses in their economic analysis. So let me be clear, NAHB joins OSHA in its stated goal of reducing workplace illnesses and injuries. The debate's not over whether to protect our workers, but how best to protect our workers. So I urge Congress to consider ways to forestall the implementation of this deeply flawed rule until OSHA has revisited the potential burden this rule will put on small businesses. I thank you for the opportunity to share my views, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Brady. I recognize Ms. Hershkowitz for your 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you. Chairman Walberg, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss OSHA's recently published Silica rule and its detrimental impact on the U.S. metal casting industry. My name is Jan Hershkowitz, president of PRL, Inc. My family moved to the States from Bolivia in 1971 to pursue the American dream. My father purchased a small company with 13 employees, which he eventually grew to 3 companies. In 1988, I moved back to Pennsylvania from Chicago to run the family business after he was diagnosed with cancer. Following his death in 1989, I opened a foundry, which is one of the cleanest and most advanced sand foundries in the U.S. Today, we have 4 manufacturing facilities, are a key military supplier, and proudly employ 150 highly skilled workers who play a vital role in our success. I am testifying before you today as a member of the American Foundry Society, our industry's trade association, which is comprised of more than 7,500 members. Our industry employs over 200,000 workers who are proud that their metal castings have applications in virtually every capital and consumer good produced. 80% of all foundries employ fewer workers than 100, including ours. As a nation, we depend on castings in all facets of our lives, including transportation, heating our homes, and most importantly, providing us with power and playing a critical role in our nation's defense, including submarines and carriers. PRL's key customers include Electric Boat, Northrop Grumman, and Curtiss-Wright. AFS members are highly committed to protecting their employees and implementing sound safety policies. PRL's culture is one of safety first above all else, as the risks of pouring molten metal are taken very seriously by every coworker, and we continually invest in safety equipment. We continually invest in safety equipment, experts, preventive maintenance, and training. We also have a certified safety committee, which consists of coworkers from every level of our organization. Realize the silica sand that we are talking about today is used by Foundry to make molds, and it is the same sand that is found on our beaches. I will only discuss a few of the ways this regulation will impact the foundry industry, as my submitted testimony is much more detailed. Under the rule, the sharply reduced permissible exposure levels of 50 micrograms and an action level of 25 micrograms equates to the contents of a packet of sweet and low sugar over a football field 13 feet high. This is the same air quality requirements of a clean room. Metal castings operations are simply not capable of achieving this level of dust control. The rule also mandates extensive and costly engineering controls. Metal casters will have to exhaust all feasible engineering and work practices controls to meet the extensive requirements before we are allowed to use respirators. This means we could be forced to spend well over $1.4 million with no guarantee that it'll work. There are certain operations in a foundry, such as grinding, where no matter how much is spent on controls, consistent compliance will not be achieved. Under the rule, regulated areas with controlled access and mandatory respirator usage will need to be established. This presents a logistical nightmare, as it means that a forklift operator or a manager who may be in the area for just a minute will need to put on a respirator and will not be able to talk. Under the regulation, dry vacuuming is not allowed and a wet vat will now be required. This is wrong, as everybody knows you never, ever want to introduce water in an area where molten metal is poured. An explosion could occur and workers' lives would be jeopardized. Also, all the sand that which may be wet, might not even be wet, but may be wet, can no longer be recycled and will go into our landfills. OSHA drastically underestimates the cost to comply and disregards the intent of SUBREFA. In reality, the actual costs of the rule are 50 times higher than OSHA estimates. In the final rule, OSHA estimated cost of compliance for the foundry industry was at $47 million or $32,000 per foundry. Our independent analysis shows that the rule will actually cost the industry over $2.2 billion, which equates to over $1 million per foundry. Additional costs include capital equipment, plant modifications, lost production time, record keeping, training, legal, medical, permit, engineering, monitoring, cleaning, and sand disposal expenses. In closing, although very well intended, our concern is that OSHA's silica regulation will cause significant foundry closures, which will shift production offshore to countries like China, who have minimal worker safety rules. I firmly believe that this rule not only poses a threat to our national security, but it will also cause many good, highly skilled people from numerous manufacturing sectors to lose their jobs. And Mr. Chairman, I would submit that this is simply wrong. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I would be happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hershkowitz. Now, Dr. Milius, you have your 5 minutes recognized right now.
Okay. Thank you, Honorable Chairman Walberg, Ranking Member Wilson, other members of the subcommittee. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today at this hearing. As I said earlier, I was an occupational physician and epidemiologist. I currently work for labor management organizations within the union construction industry, focusing on health and safety issues in construction. I have over 40 years of experience in occupational environmental health. I've been involved, I followed the development and public review of the recently released OSHA Silica standard, submitted comments, testified at the hearings, and submitted post-hearing comments on the proposed standard. One of my first patients while working in an occupational medicine clinic in Chicago in the 1970s was a young man with a severe and rapidly progressive silicosis caused by his work in a foundry. He died while in his early 30s from this disease, leaving a young family. Throughout my career in occupational health, I've continued to encounter cases of silicosis among foundry and construction workers. As Representative Wilson has already introduced 3 bricklayers, family members of bricklayers who are behind me, who've experienced in their family or themselves silicosis. We recently did a small survey of our tunnel workers in New York and found nearly 40% of them, again, young tunnel workers, had developed early stages of silicosis as a result of their work doing tunnels, building tunnels in the New York City area. So silicosis is not just a disease of the past. Workers continue to develop this disease, and the illness can have a serious impact on their health, their ability to work, and on their families. I believe that OSHA has done an excellent job of developing the new silica standard. I'd like to outline a few of the major reasons why I believe this regulation is a significant step forward in addressing this major occupational health problem. OSHA's review of the available scientific data and additional scientific studies presented during the rulemaking process provide a sound scientific basis for the new standard. They've identified key diseases, and the more recent scientific studies have provided the basis for the new standard that they put forward of 50 micrograms per cubic meter. The current OSHA standard, as has been mentioned, comes from the 1920s. It was based in a purely practical way of what could be done to deal with some of the extremely high exposures in some of the industries at that time, tunnel quarry working and so forth. That standard has not been changed until recently, and if that standard were still in place and left in place, one could have a very high rate of cancer, silicosis, and other silica-related diseases among people working at those levels of exposure. Some of the extrapolations in the OSHA rulemaking process estimate up to 100% of construction workers exposed to silica would, at the then current standard, would develop silicosis. It's clearly unacceptable. We want to control this to a much lower limit. We don't view, and I don't view, the major problem to be an issue of enforcement. I believe that the major problem is that the current standard then in place is not adequate to prevent most silica-related illnesses. We need to change the standard. It's gone on for far too long. I think it's also important, as some of the other witnesses have stated, that we need to have practical ways of controlling exposure. And as I look at it, whether it's half full or half empty glass, I think that it's a major step forward construction to have these tasks outlined and to make compliance easier in that industry. We could show up here, I'm showing two of the pictures. We earlier saw pictures of people with bricklayers and the effect of ventilation from their equipment they use. This is a milling machine that's used to take up old pavement. I don't know if you can turn that so it can be seen by the committee. But again, this is a before and after picture, and the asphalt paving industry put a lot of effort into developing proper ventilation controls for their industry in order to be able to meet the Silica standard. This work started long before the standard was even proposed. But as you can see in the first picture, and if you've ever been behind a milling machine, you know how much dust is generated. And in the second picture, which I actually believe is a picture from Michigan, by the way, the Upper Peninsula, where some of this research was done, showing that with proper ventilation and stuff that would, ventilation would be readily available through all manufacturers, you can control silica exposures. They were able to meet the new standard through this, and at a relatively reasonable price for doing so. And I think this kind of development, I think one thing that's important in looking at costs and effectiveness is not only the fact that people will meet the standard, but they'll develop better technology and better approaches to be able to do that. And I think we have to take that into account as we sort of look forward to what's going to happen as a result of the standard going in place. I'll end my oral testimony here. I'm out of time, I see, but I would be glad to answer questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you for bringing my thoughts back to pure Michigan.
Okay.
Now, for your 5 minutes of testimony, we recognize Mr. Chaillet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
Turn your microphone on there, if you would, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. We appreciate the opportunity to present the views of the United States Chamber of Commerce on this new OSHA rule impacting silica. If I may, I'd like to start with the concept that this is about sand. Right? Silica essentially is sand. And one of the things that we don't see in these pictures is the hundreds of trillions of tons of sand that exist all over the world. This rule impacts millions of people and perhaps millions of employment sites as well. Sand is an essential critical element in a variety of consumer products, construction products, national defense products, home builders products. It's extensively used. I think OSHA lists over 30 industry groups, and there are many more that are impacted by this rule. At least 2 million people plus work in areas where sand or silica is present, disturbed, or used. This is a massive rule. So that's a little bit of perspective. Much of this product is used, or material, is used in truckloads. The amount of silica dust that it would take to exceed the exposure limit is an eye drop in this room. One eye drop in a teaspoon dispersed over the size of this room would essentially exceed the exposure limit. It's an infinitesimally small amount of dust. In addition, it's not just the fact that we're concerned about silica, we're concerned about respirable silica, tiny, tiny, small particles of silica. Those are the ones that can get into the lung and can cause a significant hazard. No question about that. One case of silicosis, one fatality, one illness is one too many, and we have to prevent them. And we are preventing them. We have submitted for the record, and I would hope you would allow our statement to be placed in the record, a graph from the Center for Disease Control. I thought we were going to have a copy of it to show. It demonstrates the success of American industry and OSHA in controlling and reducing silica-related disease. These are data taken from Health and Human Services Center for Disease Control agency that collects mortality. You'll notice that just in our lifetimes, we have reduced successfully the number of cases from silica-related disease. We are approaching zero. It is a wonderful public health success story. It is a story that I'm proud to have been a part of for my 35 years of occupational safety and health experience in the law, helping companies to understand their obligations and to work to continue this trend. This was established with the current standards in place. In fact, the current standards not only, as you stated in your opening, Mr. Chairman, not only do we see OSHA not enforcing them, they have a compliance problem, 30% or so are out of compliance, more exposure than the current problem, but a significant portion, perhaps 2/3 of that, is 2 to 3 times overexposure. We have a compliance problem that is not going to be solved by a new set of regulations that took this many pages of the Federal Register to explain, not to mention the thousands of attachments to it. That's going to be an impossibility for any small to medium-sized business to comprehend. And we have this regulation, and it's based on a series of fantasies. Okay? The very concept of respirable dust is written out of this regulation by a new definition that says it's whatever dust that's collected by the sampler. So we're not even regulating the hazard. We're regulating an inaccurate sampling and analysis method. That's the best that OSHA could do. And in light of that fantasy, there are additional ones in the assumptions for how you calculate risk here. According to OSHA, there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who should be recorded with disease, and they're not there. We don't have a silica epidemic. There are many problems here with this rule. OSHA needs to refocus on reality. We have not seen a focus on drug and alcohol abuse in the workplace, one of the leading causes of fatalities, and the scourge is impacting our entire workforce and our families. Why not a focus where we need it? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be glad to answer questions.
Thank you. Thank you, each of the panel, for time and attention you gave to present your perspective. It's valuable for us to hear, as well as to see evidences of ways that we have achieved success, as well as ways that we can achieve further success. Having said that, let me recognize for the opening questioning 5 minutes from our panel. Make sure I get the... Mr. Akita, you're up on deck right now.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I appreciate having this hearing. Shahat, you practice law. You have experience practicing administrative law, correct? Yes.
Yes.
This was informal rulemaking?
It was an informal rulemaking, although the cross-examination was cut off.
Why?
I have no idea. I personally was standing asking questions, and OSHA short-circuited my ability and stopped me from asking questions.
And you have no idea why? Have you ever experienced that in your practice before?
I have never experienced my cross to be stopped.
So in just a couple seconds, try to explain for us, for the record, the difference between informal rulemaking and then the more structured formal rulemaking or negotiated rulemaking, and how this is different, and why in the world, given the nature of informal rulemaking, you would be cut off from your testimony.
Well, this is a hybrid kind of rulemaking, but there is an administrative law judge present, and the administrative law judge in the OSHA world controls the hearing process and procedure. The administrative law judge at I'm sure with OSHA's approval, consent, or discussion, cut off cross-examination. And it was particularly egregious because the other side, the advocates for the rule, were allowed to question until they were done, but the industry side was cut off. That was only one problem. All of these kinds of rulemakings rely on data transparency and truth, and that's what you want, is a record that's truthful with transparency.
You feel that didn't occur here?
We didn't have that here. We did not have that here.
You got a rule based on, with some kind of proceeding, it sounds like a kangaroo court, based on untruths, half-truths, lack of transparency, facts that were not allowed to come into evidence, and testimony that was literally cut off. Is that accurate?
It is accurate. We had the leading laboratory expert, perhaps in the world, from Bureau Veritas, testifying about the inability to measure, and he was responded to by an OSHA staff witness who runs their laboratory and said to him, would you believe that we have this secret data that we've not published that proves that we can measure at this level? And I sat back and couldn't believe my ears. This was not a legitimate rulemaking.
They admitted to secret data? What do you mean?
It did, during the hearing.
And
in the
who, I use the
transcript.
pronoun, I hate doing that. I use the pronoun they. Who's they again?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Excuse me, I use the pronoun they. Who is they again? I said they use secret data?
OSHA staff.
All right, thank you very much. Ms. Hershkowitz, I appreciate your personal story and that of you and your family. Can you go into detail how OSHA has failed to take into account public perspectives like yours and how this is harmful to a free republic?
Wow, where to begin? The issue with OSHA, we did testify before OIRA. They absolutely, totally ignored 50 pages, I think it was 50 pages of testimony that we submitted.
What do you mean ignored?
Well, they didn't take into account all the costs, but just to give you an example, here's an OSHA fact sheet. I pulled this off the internet on April 6th, so this is after the rule was passed. And we spoke very strongly about the costs that this will entail. And on this fact sheet, it says the annual cost to a firm with fewer than 20 employees would be less, averaging about $550. Now, the average cost for our employee we view to be $143,000. And this was these exact facts I gave to the OIRA committee when I went and talked before them. And it also says the proposal rule is expected to have no discernible impact on U.S. employment. So I think this speaks volumes. And the other thing is that why can't we just go with respirators first because the worker is breathing clean air? OSHA insists right now upon putting and measuring air respirators outside of the air respirator, and we have to put money in for dust collection systems that we feel won't work. They also ignore the fact you can't just add one more dust collector, one more dust collector, and one more dust collector. It's not additive. You've got to get a dust collector, and I'm not even sure if it exists in today's world, that actually can take all that sand out, and it will easily be over $1 million. So that's how we were disregarded by OSHA.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, without objection, I'd ask for inclusion of the document that Ms. Hershkowitz was referring to for inclusion in the record.
Absolutely, you can have it.
Hearing no objection, the record will be included.
And my time's expired. I yield back.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize our ranking member, Ms. Wilson, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Malouis, your testimony says that the permissible exposure limit for construction that has been in place since 1971 was based on a recommendation from the Public Health Services in the 1920s. Was that recommendation from the 1920s based on preventing silicosis, or was it simply based on the feasibility of ventilation controls available in the 1920s?
Well, it was to some extent to prevent silicosis, but the level set was what the Public Health Service staff at the time felt was feasible to be met, that could be met in the industries where they had noted the high silica exposures. So they recognize that it would not be completely protective of it would not be completely prevent all cases of silicosis in those industries.
Some people argue that reported cases of silicosis are declining in recent years, and there is not a significant risk. Does this argument exclude other health outcomes other than silicosis that have been well established? Lung cancer, renal disease, respiratory diseases such as COPD.
Yes, it does exclude those. We don't have good surveillance mechanisms for following or detecting those diseases and reporting, and certainly not ones that would relate those to silica exposure. The bricklayers and allied craft actually had submitted some data to the record for the OSHA hearing showing that lung disease overall among their deaths from lung disease among their workforce, their members, had stayed steady throughout up until close to the present time. So they don't see a decline among their members. So it's, and that would include both silicosis and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease.
Is there a significant risk from silica dust exposure today? What is that risk? And what is wrong with the argument made by the U.S. Chamber that OSHA is chasing a nearly insignificant risk?
Well, I think that it is well, the risk we know is for the occurrence of silicosis, lung cancer, kidney disease, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. These are all serious health problems and can cause people to die related to their past work or current work with silica. So these are obviously significant to the people who suffer, as you've heard, and as testimony from the three people sitting behind me can testify to. They're also significant in the sense that among the populations exposed, one of the problems with the death certificate surveillance that Mr. Chayette showed from the Centers for Disease Control, those are death certificates, and silicosis is not included on many death certificates, even among people that have it. We do fewer autopsies now. We do, I think there's an estimate actually from the state of Michigan where they've done a statistical analysis and showed that over 85% of people with silicosis do not have silicosis put on their death certificate. And it's just an artifact of how we practice medicine now and how many autopsies and what happens when a person dies in terms of what the doctor writes on the death certificate. So that level is down. We also know that the amount of exposure to silica is decreasing overall in terms of the people exposed, because many of the industries that use silica, particularly the foundry industry, is decreased. Number of foundry workers in this country have gone greatly down, and that was a major group at risk of silicosis. So within foundries themselves, of ones that currently exist, we could still very well have a high rate of silicosis. Maybe not all foundries, but many foundries, if they are not meeting even if they meet the current standard.
One witness argues that all that is needed is more OSHA enforcement to address the problem. If there was 100% enforcement wall to wall for each facility each year, would that eliminate the need for more protective standards?
It certainly would be a change, but it would not. I mean, that hypothetical, not, because the current standard is not protective. There will continue to be a number of cases of silicosis that occur. I mean, OSHA's done an estimate of that, and I think we know from all the health risk assessments that have been done for this standard, again, peer-reviewed by outside scientists, that this is not protected, and even with comprehensive and complete enforcement, we would continue to have not only silicosis cases, but cases of lung cancer, kidney disease, the other illnesses related to silica exposure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank the General Lead.
Appreciate it.
I recognize now the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Bishop, for your 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your attention to this matter, bringing this before the committee, and thank you for the panel for being here today and providing your testimony. Mr. Brady, I was interested in hearing all of this testimony. It's amazing to me that what's going on here and how pervasive it is across the government and the economy. We hear the same concern in just about every sector of the economy that's regulated by the federal government. Your testimony highlights some of the safety concerns that engineering controls create, such as water sprays on a tile roof. It seems to me that we might be solving a problem and creating another. Can you explain how the final rule fails to adequately address these safety concerns?
I think there's a number of different areas during construction that OSHA hasn't paid attention to, and that is the practical side of I'm in Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, all the Midwest states. We're building throughout the year, and there's freezing temperatures. And if they're required to add water to the exterior, whether it's brick cutting, block cutting, tile roof installation, it potentially creates, certainly on a 612 pitch roof, it creates a hazard probably more or equal to the possibility of adding water to cutting those tiles, depending on, again, depending on the pitch of the roof and the installation procedure. So there are many elements of the rule that actually could create hazards in trying to protect from the silica.
Maybe it's just me, but that seems like a pretty obvious problem. Was that ever taken into consideration?
No, I don't. I mean, in our remarks about the rule, and we commented on a number of these issues, and we feel that OSHA just did not look at and pay attention to the number of comments that we made, didn't incorporate them into the rule on a practical, technologically feasible, and economically feasible position. And so, again, we're willing to work with OSHA on these, and we were willing, and we've put hours and hours and hours working with OSHA, but they ignored most of what. Now, I will say, I'll give them a bit. They took adding water to dust or the dirt on a floor before you sweep it. They took that out. And if any of you try and sweep a mud floor, it's not so easily done. And so those are the types of practical things that they ignored in great part.
Okay, thank you very much. So many questions there. Ms. Hershkowitz, I noted your discussion about the respirator and some of these protective equipment that's out there. Has the quality of that equipment changed over the years? I know this rule has been kind of lingering since, what, 1990? Has it changed over the past couple of decades?
Oh, absolutely. The old respirators used to be very bulky, very uncomfortable, and there's been a lot of research on respirators, which has turned into much better product that's much more comfortable for the person to use. And what we would like under this regulation is to use the respirators first versus going with the expensive dust collectors.
I would assume that the current respirators are far better at doing what they're supposed to do than the previous iterations.
By far, and OSHA does measure the air quality outside of the respirator, which is not indicative of what a worker is breathing. A worker is actually breathing clean air, and we do use respirators in our facilities for certain jobs right now.
Okay, great. Mr. Kayat, I hope did I pronounce that right?
Fine.
Thank you. You know, we're just talking about these personal protective equipment. OSHA seems to dismiss the use of these personal protective equipment as an effective way to protect employees from silica exposure. Is that true? Can you share with me your thoughts on that?
Congressman, the agency has really lost its focus on protecting people. And I'm not sure what they're protecting, but the state of respirator science, I don't even call them respirators, they're mini environments. Some of these devices are very comfortable hard hats that put fresh air over a person's face, and it's filtered or it's clean, and they're comfortable and they don't provide any pressure. Others are paper but incredibly high quality, simple like painter's mask type respirators that, again, I'm not so sure we should call them respirators other than mini environments. But when we have such effective technology for protecting people, why should we discount it? Why should we not credit an employer who's protecting their employees with this technology? It's the way of the future, and OSHA is living in the past.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now I recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, a northern state as well, Mr. Pocan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I think this is my third hearing on Silica, and I have to admit, sometimes I start to lose my patience a little as we go through these hearings when I hear some of the comments. You know, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not the CEO of a big business. I have a small specialty printing business, union shop, and I have done every job that any employee in my business has done over the years. And I know I only make money when I've got customers and when I have employees to do the work, because I can't do everything. So I value my employees far more than I value my equipment. We just bought a brand new UV printer that was about $75,000. And I can buy a cheaper solvent printer for $25,000, but that puts volatile organic compounds into the air, causes health risks. And there's other good things about the printer, but clearly part of the decision I made was that I want to make sure my employees aren't exposed to problems. And I've heard a lot of bad math and slippery language during this debate. So if I can, let me just try to address some of this and ask a few questions. Mr. Shayad, I mean, I'm going to pass on you right now. I'm going to ask the people who are employees some questions. I know you raised a lot of concerns about sand, but honestly, my guess is, as a lawyer for the U.S. Chamber, the closest you're going to get to exposure to sand is if you go on vacation to the Caribbean. So let me ask Mr. Brady a question, if I could, specifically. So there is another construction company, a medium-sized company in Illinois, Englewood Construction, and the director of operations there, if I can just read his quote real quickly in the time I have. Let me just get to the relevant part, maybe. He said, many of the new Silica guidelines formalize existing best practices. Elements of the Silica rule will require real change and will take time, effort, and yes, money to implement consistently. It's easy to see the cost of added protection for our workers, but how do you put a price on workers' health and long-term well-being? And he goes on a little longer. I really sympathize with that, because I understand, and I think, you know, you've got employees, and I'm sure you go to their, you know, family events, you've watched their kids graduate and everything, and I know that's an important part of it. But, you know, one of the things you said is you talked about the 3.2 million construction workers and these, you know, physicals they're going to have. The reality is it's only if they've got 30 days on a respirator, and that's only a fraction, a very small fraction of the jobs that require it. So again, and it's every 3 years. So it's a little bit of, I fall that in the slippery language category. It's not quite where it's at. But I would ask the question, how do you value what a life is worth? What is a life worth? It's a tough question.
Yeah, it's a pretty tough question. It's not a question of whether or not our industry wants to protect lives. It's a question of whether or not technologically or economically this rule is feasible. So I wouldn't get into an argument whether or not any protection is worth a life.
Sure.
It's whether you can provide it. It's whether, you know, somebody mentioned earlier, 93% of silica-related illnesses have been reduced by 93% in the last 40 years.
So I'm going to yield my time back. So again, there's fewer people in the industry is part of why. So that same graph that the person who's afraid of the beach sand has, it also shows the employee numbers in those fields have gone down. So again, it's a little bit of slippery language to use that,
sorry to interrupt,
if I
there
can.
is.
Let me yield back my time, Mr. Brady. I only have a minute and a half left, and I want to ask another question, Mrs. Hershkowitz. So you, on the pictures that you've got here, you do a lot of work for submarines, I see, and I've got a company in my district that does a lot of work for submarines. How much is too much that we would have to spend if we knew we could fix something on a submarine to make it healthier for the people, service members? What amount would be a fair amount, that you would say is a fair amount to put in to protect the people who are on that submarine? Is there a dollar figure you would say, 50,000, 100,000, $500,000?
I think workplaces should be very, very safe. We do a lot to make it safe.
Right, but you
What
keep
I am
bringing up
saying
the
is-
amount of the per foundry, what it's going to cost, and the OSHA said 32,000. You're saying 1 million. I'm asking specifically, what would be the dollar figure you would assign that you would be willing to spend to make a submarine safe for the people who work on a submarine?
We're doing
It's a dollar question.
First of all,
A dollar question.
all the components we put on the submarine are very, very.
It's asking you, so you don't have an amount that you would recommend? How about how many sugar packets worth of silica
This is,
in that football field that's 13 high would you say is acceptable? You're saying one is nothing, but what point, how many sugar packets are a problem? That's the problem.
There is
you want
no-
to talk about, if I can, you want to talk about the
Is there a
safety, but you
question?
don't actually want to answer the questions. I mean, I've asked you
I
very
do
direct
wanna
questions. Let's
answer
go back to
the
the submarine question. I'll let you answer. How much
I
would you
want-
spend to make a submarine safe? It's a dollar question.
It's a question in terms of putting
So
a
you don't want to answer the
respirator.
questions. That's
The
the problem. I
gentleman's
yield
time has
back.
expired.
I am trying to answer the question.
No, you're not.
I will now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Scott, for his questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Malayas, can you give us a little history about how long we've known about the dangers of silica?
Well, the history of our knowledge of silicosis and resulting from quarrying and other kinds of work like that go back to Roman times. Hippocrates recognized it. Goes back up into certainly into the Italian Renaissance, the 1600s. A doctor named Ramazzini described it also, and throughout up through the centuries. And then in the United States, we recognized it back in the early part of the 1900s, last century, because we had epidemics of silicosis among quarry workers, particularly up in Vermont. We had tunneling workers, West Virginia, other areas, New York, among other things, and among foundry workers. So it was recognized in the early part of the century in the United States as a public health problem, in fact. Again, we talked earlier about that's where the standard came from, originally came from that's being used. So the knowledge goes way back, and certainly we're well aware of it in the United States for many, many years.
Did I understand you to say that the chance of coming down with silicosis, if you're exposed at the present level, is about 100%?
Yes, sir. If you go look at the construction standard and you look at how that might project out in the number of the occurrence of silicosis, people exposed at that standard could very well, up to all 100% of them could develop silicosis because of that exposure.
And can you describe the health problems that result?
Yes, the obvious health problem we mostly talk about is silica, which is a stiffening fibrosis of the lungs. Lungs just became so stiff that person can no longer breathe. It's a very horrible disease to experience, but we also have other illnesses. Lung cancer, which has been relatively recently, in the last 30 or 40 years, recognized as a risk from silica exposure, as well as kidney disease and other pulmonary disease from that exposure. So it's not just silicosis, but it's these other diseases that are a very significant risk for anybody working with silica.
Now, what kind of health cost savings can be generated if you reduce exposure?
They would be very significant, given that I can't give you an exact number, but cost of treating a case of lung cancer can be hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Somebody, if they survive for any period of time. Silicosis, a person with severe silicosis can also medical costs can be extremely high due to repeated hospitalizations and the kind of medication and other care that they may need. Same with the chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and the kidney disease. So these are very high, and they're very devastating for families to experience.
Now, I've been advised that OSHA estimates an annual net benefit over the next 60 years of an annual $3.8 to $7.7 billion after an annual cost of the rule of about $1 billion. a net benefit of 3.8 to 7.7. What kind of underlying numbers would they be looking at?
Well, what they would be looking at would be the medical costs, the cost of loss of employment for the people that are affected by that, those diseases. They no longer work, so they're going to be getting workers' compensation, government, Social Security disability, other forms of income assistance, hopefully. So I think those would be the main costs. There'd be a loss of productivity. People would lose their trained workforce, skilled workforce.
Yeah,
I mean,
some businesses have to pay this in terms of higher healthcare costs, healthcare premiums, and workers' compensation. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Now, some have talked about the costs. Could you tell me if you're aware if the National Asphalt Paving Association has taken a position on the rule?
Yes, I am. That's the group I worked with closely on, both looking at controlling exposures to asphalt as well as controlling silica exposures, the two pictures we have up there. And they are supportive of the rule. They submitted comments. OSHA was responsive to those comments regarding requirement for respirators. And when the rule came out, they came out in support of that rule.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and now I recognize the gentlelady from beautiful state of North Carolina, Ms. Adams.
Thank you, Chairman Wahlberg and Ranking Member Wilson, and I'd also like to thank our witnesses for testifying today. Before I get started, I want to just make a very simple point about the Department of Labor. One of their primary reasons for existence is to improve working conditions for working people. It's clear that the purpose of this rule is to improve the working conditions of some of our most vulnerable employees, and as we know, exposure to silica is a serious health hazard, and while many have pointed to reductions in silicosis as a reason to oppose this rule, I believe that these generalizations are very misguided, especially for low-wage workers who are often workers of color. Silica dust-related illnesses have a greater impact on low-income ethnic minority groups than on the general population, and it's especially true for the Latino community. Dr. Melius, with that in mind, can you speak to the positive impact that this rule will have on low-wage earners and communities of color who are disproportionately affected by silica-related illnesses?
Yeah, yes, I can, and actually there's data to show from the state of Michigan that African-American workers are at much higher risk of developing silicosis there that's been found. So what you're saying is what we actually can see in some of the data that we do collect about the risk of silicosis. But this rule should benefit everybody that's exposed to silicon. We also know that African-American, Hispanic workers, Latino workers tend to work in so-called dirty jobs where there's more exposure, and do that. And if this rule is put in place and completely, enforced, properly enforced, we should see great benefits to them, because they may often work in what can be so-called the dirtiest jobs, the jobs with the highest exposures. And hopefully, as this rule goes in place, they will be protected as well as everybody else that's exposed to silica.
Thank you, sir. So it's your opinion then that this is a step in the right direction in addressing racial health disparities?
Absolutely.
In addition to saving many lives and reducing illnesses among workers who are exposed to silica dust, this rule will also create billions in net benefits. Dr. Melius, can you explain on what some of those benefits will be and how they will play into the industry's ability to capture savings associated with safer and healthier employees?
Yes. Certainly there'll be reduced medical costs for caring for employees, reduced either through health insurance or workers' compensation for those employees. There'll be better ability to retain highly trained and skilled workers in the workplace. Do that. So rather than having to replace people because they're becoming ill, your most experienced and trusted workers, they'll be able to work for a longer period of time and which will help maintain and improve productivity for the industries involved, whether it's general industry or in the construction industry.
Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate it. And Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield my time back.
Thank you, sir.
I thank the gentlelady. I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Desaulniers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, a question for Ms. Herkowitz. So I just handed this document that I'm told is part of a trade association that you're part of, Control Silica Exposure Foundries by AES. Are you familiar with this?
I've seen it, but I have not read it. I just saw it this morning. Thank you.
All right. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter it into the record. It seems, at least on a very quick look, that the organization's done a lot of work in this regard. And again, just preliminarily looking at it, it seems that there's some contradictions. So just having sat here and listened to the contradiction between Dr. Milius and the rest of you about we're all on the same page, we want to use effective, cost-effective implementation, feasibility. To Dr. Milius, just in terms of the feasibility, I mean, you're a public health expert, but it's interesting, just the diversity, and I appreciate Mr. Brady's comments about everybody wanting to invest effectively on reducing the public health issue and the graph that's been presented by the Chamber. Do you have comments on how feasible you think, recognizing you're a public health person?
I believe that the control recommendations that are either directly contained in the standard or that will be developed in response to this standard are very feasible to control and achieve the levels that are involved. OSHA and everyone involved spent a lot of time looking at, I mentioned with the silica milling machines, that work started almost 10 years ago in terms of getting ready for the possibility of a new standard. The foundry document that you mentioned goes back to, I believe, to 2010, 2008. Can't remember it directly, but again, we're part of people recognizing that that there may be a standard coming and getting prepared for it. The kind of ventilation that's on this kind of saw is also something that people have been working with to demonstrate that there are practical ways of meeting the standard and that they are cost effective.
Mr. Brady, I appreciate meeting with you, and you know about my concern coming from Northern California about the need for both market rate housing in high-cost areas for working people and for others, and also for affordable housing. So in California since 2008, the standards have been, they went to the higher standards in terms of prevention. Do you have any comments about that, or your California colleagues? I mean, knowing many people in the home building industry, as when I met with you in my office in Richmond, California, they are able to work in a fairly, I'm choosing my words here, aggressive regulatory atmosphere and still make a handsome profit and provide the product that we need.
Well, I think even in our conversation, again, this isn't about providing the issue isn't only health, it's about providing a product for a price, right? You have to be, in your district alone, starter homes are $450,000, and you know that better than I do.
I don't think I could find a $450,000 home in my district.
So, you know, you have to have balance and regulatory reform. You have to have balance whether or not you can provide it economically, but even technologically, whether or not, as somebody said, silica is in soil. So as we're grading a lot, silica is kicked up in soil. How do you economically and feasibly or technologically provide that at an affordable cost and be able to provide a product that consumers can buy?
I appreciate that. Having heard that argument in the air quality field for 20 years when it came to sulfur, lead, MTBE, but we were able to pass regulatory investments that the affected community came up to the standards, and we provided off-ramps if they weren't making it. So my question was that we've had the more aggressive prevention at Cal OSHA in place since 2008, and the industry has coped with it. Granted, they'll have to come up to these higher standards in terms of the micrograms, but have you had any input from your members as to what a disadvantage that is? Because honestly, I haven't heard it, and it's been in place for 8 years.
Well, again, no, for dollar, no. I understand that from our members, this is a very cumbersome compliance issue that on our construction, our industry seems to be targeted specifically to this rule because there will have a huge impact on the cost to provide product. Now, again, over the last 40 years, our industry, drywall mud is a good example where our industry took silica out of drywall mud. It's no longer a hazard, and our industry continues to do that. Yes, maybe there's fewer workers, but they're also building better product and creating, and that's the type of environment, cooperative environment that we would like to work with OSHA to make practical, economically, and technologically feasible.
I appreciate that, and I'd love to have a further discussion with you and OSHA on doing that. I just, as a footnote, I just handed a note that there are Canadian provinces that are actually 25 micrograms, so we might look at that and see how cost-effective that's been as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Forward to that.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize myself for my 5 minutes of questioning. Ms. Hershkowitz, it's not up to you, really, how much it will cost for a safe submarine component, is it? Who is it up to decide how much it will cost? Wouldn't you say it's the federal government in the contracting process and electric boat, and ultimately you have to find a way to produce that product if they say so, and if you can't, someone else will have to produce it, correctly?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point we need to make here.
I also want to make the point that our foundry is safety first. Anybody can stop a heat if they feel it is unsafe. We have safety leaders at every level of the organization. We have spent an awful lot of money on safety and are very, very proud of our safety record.
Yeah.
And I value our employees very, very strongly.
And I would expect that.
Yeah.
Those people work for you, provide the opportunity to get a contract with Electric Boat.
It's not easy.
It's not easy to get.
Not easy.
And they ultimately decide what a cost will be for safe. They expect that component to work. Let me go on here.
Absolutely, and I never, ever want to sacrifice cost for safety.
OSHA suggests that the company, talking of the brick industry, as was pointed out, can pay the necessary engineering alterations out of the first year's profit. Could your company pay for the necessary compliance activity out of the first year's profit, as OSHA has suggested in its preamble?
No, we have 4 separate companies. We opened the foundry last just because we could no longer buy castings in this country, and we're probably the most vertically integrated sand foundry in the country. We view our foundry as a cost center, not a profit center, and according to the AFS, that the cost of putting these regulations in place are 273% of the profits of a company, but it's even higher of a foundry. It's even much, much higher for us.
In that case, the castings that can't be purchased now for your components, your products, your production,
Correct.
if this goes through, the castings can't be produced in this country again, since you won't be there, correct?
Right.
Okay.
Conceivably.
Conceivably.
Yeah.
Again,
Yeah,
it goes back to that creative tension between jobs, the necessity of jobs, having a successful ability to create, sustain, and carry on, versus putting in safety. And we want to go as close to possible meeting that need in both ways. But there definitely are cost issues that will influence whether you can do the...
That is correct, and the foundry industry standard is a PEL of now has 100, which 70% of the foundries are able to meet, 30% are not. And I personally, now I'm not speaking for the AFS right now, but I have personally, as a 25-year foundry woman, have never heard of a case of silicosis, much less within our own companies.
Mr. Brady, construction is fundamentally different than other professions. Your testimony discusses how Table 1 of the regulation does not adjust appropriately for the modern construction workforce. Can you expand on the concerns of the industry as a whole with Table 1?
Well, Table 1, I think, has 18 points to it. Our industry is so complex. I'll have 100 people on a construction site during the 3 months that I build it. On a home building. On remodeling is entirely different. in a remodeling project is a good example of where Table 1 doesn't really answer some of these questions. And so they default to the very stringent. There are no remediation issues potentially on the remodeling side, and so they default to the very restrictive compliance issues, and because they can't comply with throwing water into a remodeled or a home. When they demolish a wall, they can't throw water into that wall to create the dust, so they have to use other means, so this rule really sets our members, from builder, remodeler, to the associates, to the thousands of members throughout the country, for failure, because technologically we will not be able to comply with this rule.
What does the specialty contractors that often work concurrently with you add to this mix? Specifically, the multi-employer citation policy that OSHA has. How does that add to additional problems in compliance?
Well, again, we're a fairly transient business. I'm a general contractor, so I use small business subcontractors, and their employees move seasonally. They move from employee to employee. They move around. So it's going to be very cumbersome. Number one, if I have to test, say I'm a brick mason, and I have to test my employee today, I have to baseline medical exam. 3 months later, they're working in Indiana with another contractor. I think the rule suggests that they have to be baselined with that. So to say that they're only going to be tested every 3 years is a miscalculation, because our business is transient, people move. And so just kind of the logistics of these specialty contractors and their employees is going to be very difficult to comply with.
Thank you. My time has expired, and now I will recognize the ranking member, Ms. Wilson, for her closing comments.
Thank you, Chairman Wahlberg, for calling today's hearing and giving us the opportunity to discuss this very important rule. I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony. Thank you for coming. Every committee hearing, every markup, every press conference, I endeavor to remind my colleagues of our purpose as the subcommittee members. This is the Workforce Protections Subcommittee, and that means our job is to protect our workers. I stand with my colleagues in strong support of DOL's updated silica dust standard. We know that the science is clear. Workers exposed to silica dust at levels allowable under the previous OSHA silica standards are at risk of developing deadly and debilitating diseases such as silicosis, lung cancer, and renal disease. The Department of Labor took a long-awaited strong step towards helping the 2.3 million workers exposed to silica dust by finalizing its updated rule on March 23rd, 2016. We know that controlling silica dust is feasible. Controlling silica dust is a well-understood and time-tested proposition. Wet the dust down or vacuum it up, water or air. States like California and New Jersey already have in place standards and regulations requiring companies to use water systems or vacuums to control dust. Nationwide, many companies put their workers' health first by controlling silica dust with existing technology. New equipment now comes equipped with dust controls or water spray hookups. We know that this rule will protect worker health. Above all, we must judge this rule by its ability to protect our workers. As we have heard, once fully implemented, this updated rule will save more than 600 lives and prevent more than 900 cases of silicosis each year. OSHA's new standard includes engineering controls, training, prohibitions on dry sweeping, and medical surveillance that will do much to protect workers, especially in the building trades. There is strong support for DOL's updated silica rule to protect workers. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record letters of support from the following organizations: United Steelworkers, the Blue-Green Alliance, Public Citizens Congress Watch, American Association for Justice, American Public Health Association, Inglewood Construction, Motley Rice LLC, America's Agenda, International Union of Bricklayers and Allied Craft Workers. I want to thank the witnesses again for being here today. And I want to thank those in the audience who have traveled to join us in your support for DOL's updated Silica rule. I want to read a letter, a part of a letter from Chuck Taylor of Inglewood Construction, a mid-sized construction contractor based in Lamont, Illinois, with projects underway in 8 states. He writes this: "We realize it will take time and effort to implement the updated silica dust exposure guidelines, and in some cases, there will be an added cost. But we also believe we owe it to the workers who are so vital to the construction industry to do what we can to protect their health and their safety." This is a very powerful statement from a company with skin in the game. How can you put a price on a human life, or on their suffering, and on the suffering of their families? You just morally cannot put a price on that. I want to close with the words of Tim Brown, a worker with silicosis who has joined us here today. You met him earlier. Raise your hand, Tim. Tim writes, "We must prevent this from happening to any other bricklayers. To my fellow union members and to my unorganized colleagues, no worker should suffer what I have. The previous standard did not protect me, but if we enforce the new comprehensive rule, what happened to me will not happen to other bricklayers. We cannot let others suffer and become ill just for doing an honest day's work." Thank you, Tim, for your words. Thank you, Tom and Dale, for bravely representing the millions of workers and families affected by silica. I hope our subcommittee can honor the lives of those who have become ill, who have died from silica-related illnesses, and support this updated rule. I yield the remainder of my time, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentlelady, and we would certainly identify with a number of your sentiments very clearly. There is no price for a life. It's important. Our responsibility, though, is to make sure that those lives are able to work in a beneficial way on the job site and carry on and pass that on as well to family members for an opportunity that this country affords basically like unlike any other country in the world. I'd like that chart that was displayed earlier put up on the board, just for context again. At the very least, we can agree. That's the direction we want to go. That's the direction we want to go. Reducing silicosis. Now, there might be variables in the numbers there, a little bit up, a little bit down. But that's the direction we want to go, and with the present standard, even with weaknesses in the actual enforcement of that standard, that's where we're at. Through all of the hearings that we've had, and it's correct, we've had multiple hearings on this silicosis rule, trying to press upon OSHA, Department of Labor, that this is a serious consideration, and it impacts all of us in the room and all outside of this room, on industry continuing to provide the products, the services that are necessary in this great country. It's been stated by a colleague of mine on the other side of the aisle that China's not doing these things. Well, we don't want to go backwards to what China's doing. We don't want to give our products away to China either, or any other country. We want to continue to compete. This isn't only the construction industry. This crosses the board. As we've heard about multiple industries that have impact of silica. There have been thousands, literally thousands of comments submitted to OSHA in the rulemaking process. Sadly, it's clear that some of those comments were rejected, not simply rejected because they didn't make sense, but just out of hand, apparently for philosophical differences. That doesn't bode well for a standard that works. My father worked at U.S. Steel. Now, I don't know whether he eventually got lung cancer as a result of that job, but he did. Ultimately, thankfully, due to experimental therapy, he not only lived, but he went on to work till he was 73 years of age as a machinist, tool and die maker, because he loved it, and he would work longer, didn't wear out. I worked at that same plant, U.S. Steel South Works, south side of Chicago, out of high school. My second job after being a laborer there at the plant was as a furnace and ladle repairman's helper. It was an interesting job. I mixed a lot of mortar. I cut a lot of tile bricks for those ladles that took the molten steel from the furnace, as well as got inside those furnaces when they were shut down to help repair those as well. Now, I don't know, well, I guess I could say, I'm sure that the policies that are in place right now probably weren't in place back in 1969, at least fully. I'm still breathing okay, and I hope that continues. I don't know about the ladle repairman, whether he is or not. But we want to see things work well. That same plant, those same set of furnaces, 10 minutes after I left work one night, left the locker room heading back to my car, half-mile from number 2 electric furnace where I work, exploded. The entire locker room was gone. Everything around it was gone because a burn through from the heat went down into the sewer and blew up. I agree with you, Ms. Hershkowitz. We don't want to mess around with water around molten steel. These are considerations that OSHA ought to take in consideration. So we're talking here of flexibility. We're talking of using controls. We're talking of using technology. We're talking about using tools, we ought to be at least, that protect the worker, that makes a clean breathing space for them to carry on the necessary work they do, and not have a simple one-size-fits-all because we think it ought to be that way. Now, that's why we had this hearing again today. It's after the fact, but I'm still hopeful that somehow, some way, we can make sure we preserve jobs, we preserve trades, we preserve futures for people in this country that they can pass on doing good work that needs to be done here and not someplace else. Yes, we can make sure that there aren't foundry jobs available. Everybody will be safer as a result of that. Maybe. But we won't have those foundry jobs and we won't have those products built. Now, that's what we wrestle with. It's not an issue of whether we discount life. It's an issue of whether we sustain life and move industry forward to make America what it is. And that's what this is about. I want to express my deep appreciation to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. I want to express my appreciation to the witnesses, all four at the table, and everyone in this room today for taking this serious. And I hope as a result of it, we'll see OSHA maybe even step back and say, we might want to listen to some of the information more carefully. We might have a better way that ultimately protects the individuals involved with this, as well as the workplace. Having got on and off my hobby horse right now, and seeing that there's no further business for the subcommittee today, the committee stands adjourned.
I've been in South. Have you? Yeah.